thank you for joining us. This is an event that is organized by the Center for Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation. We have with us Mr. Samar, who is actually the person around whom this talk has been organized. And really, what I thought I would do is set up a framework for introducing his documentary that's going to be screened on Thursday. And what time is that, Jagdish?
3:30.
Yes.
No,
it's 5:30. Start will 6:30.
So the film is going to be screened in Utown on Thursday in the evening. So my talk is titled Interrogating Development, Mining and Corporate Social Responsibility in India. And what I thought through this talk I will do is outline some key arguments about corporate social responsibility, or CSR, and how CSR has come to define the landscape of development, and particularly so through the lens of mining. So I hope to critically interrogate this idea about development and what it means as seen through the lens of corporate social responsibility. So to begin with, sort of talking about development theory, and particularly looking at development communication theory, you can think about early development communication framed within the logics of modernization, right? So you consider Daniel Lerner, early communication theorist, who thought about development as a linear trajectory from primitiveness to modernity. The passing of traditional society, which is Lerner's classic text, which also happens to form the foundation of communication as a discipline in many ways, is built on this idea that you can use communication to industrialize and modernize. In those early days of communication work, development communication was being utilized to diffuse seed technologies in rural communities across the globe, with the idea that through the dissemination of seeds, you will bring about development by changing and technologizing agriculture. This kind of a framework in modernization theory then sort of picks out this linear movement theories, and you see this playing out in the post-positivist line of research in communication theory, which argues this idea that through communication you can change people's attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. In a very simplistic sense, the idea behind these modernization theories was that when you bring about new technologies such as the television, technologies such as the radio, they will bring about modernity. So modernity measured as a product of and in correlation with new communication technologies. So development communication as a change agent is situated in that backdrop, with the idea that communication can be a positive force in society in order to bring about change. And this sort of becomes the basis then for later work on diffusion of innovations, which sort of constitutes the bulwark of communication research, particularly in the third world and in the global south, where agencies like the United States Agency for International Development, DFID, carried development communication projects precisely with the idea that communication can serve as an instrument, as a channel for disseminating new communication technologies and for creating awareness. We move, however, from sort of the diffusion of innovations framework that continued to dominate in the 80s up until the mid and late 90s to the neoliberal framework of development logic. And one of the arguments I will make is that these two frameworks, the traditional notions of development and the idea of the neoliberal market and the free market notions of development are intertwined, because if you think about early developmentalist logics, going back to the Marshall Plan, they were also built on this idea that opening up of markets will be brought about through the modernization of technology. Sometimes we often conflate between these two ideas. We think that developmentalist narrative is perhaps different from the neoliberal narrative. I would perhaps make the argument that these two narratives are complicit with each other, rather they work hand in hand with each other, meaning that early forms of development interventions were really instruments of neoliberal free market ideas and principles. And in that sense then, within this conflation of diffusion of innovations and neoliberal frameworks arises the new development terminology. So the new development terminology, I will make the argument, works through the language of corporate social responsibility, works through the language of public-private partnerships, where corporate sectors, owners of capital actually become the instruments of development. So in that sense then, you also mark out a shift from the role of the state, which of course played a key role in facilitating the market. Right? So when USAID was carrying out projects in various parts of the global south in terms of development communication projects, it was also of course working hand in hand to liberalize the economies. But that relationship now has changed a little bit in terms of the market taking the front seat in carrying out the role and functions of the state. So meaning that within this new development logic, it is the market, it is the capital that holds the ownership for carrying out development programs and development projects. And that is the narrative within which then I will situate the contemporary articulation of mining. So in terms of the narrative of mining, mining emerges within this framework as essential to national development. So if you think about the mining paradigm, and if you connect this paradigm to the idea of building infrastructures and building capacity, now the idea of building the capacity has moved away from the state being responsible for building this capacity to the market, the owners of capital being responsible for building this capacity. So mining companies, owners of mining technologies have the responsibility in investing in these technologies and in building them. So mining becomes intrinsic to the notion of national development. Along with that then is also the idea of sustainable national development, meaning that as you build in the mining infrastructure, that comes to be articulated and realized through discourses of sustainability. You build technologies in ways that are less polluting, that are innovative, that are green. So these discourses of greenery, the discourses of sustenance of the earth are tied to the logic of mining. And I think this is a key move that I want you to keep in mind, which is that essential to the notion of mining as a framework for national development is also the idea of sustainability. And that is where the privatization logic enters. How? Because the argument goes that in order to nationally develop these mining sectors, the state sector and the public sector is incapable because it cannot invest in the technologies of capital that can be green, that can be innovative. So the innovation should be left into the hands of the owners of capital that can, through innovative means, develop these national resources through sustainable ways. So doing business then in sustainable ways becomes another buzzword in this process, meaning that as we participate in the economy, you generate capital in ways that are sustainable, not simply in terms of environment and logics of greenery and environmentalism, but also sustainability defined in terms of relationships of the business organization with the community. So sustainable business organizations are ones that have harmonious relationships with communities. Rather than simply extracting resources from the communities, they pay attention to how they can give back to the community. So this is the logic within which businesses come to emerge within this sustainability narrative. In this sense then, corporate social responsibility becomes the term that holds this picture together, because it is through CSR organizations come to define their relationships with communities and define sustainability as the lens through which that relationship can be carried out. Within that framework of sustainability then, development emerges as participation. So you will see for most organizations that talk about the narrative of development within their CSR rhetoric, they will simultaneously talk about the idea that sustainability in CSR can be achieved through participation. So the emphasis then is on participatory processes, creating processes of participatory appraisal that can give organizations or these mining companies this idea of license to operate. How many of you have heard that term? That is the new buzzword, right? As a mining organization, you need to have license to operate in the communities. And how do you arrive at that license? Through participation. So if you bring your stakeholder groups that you have identified to the table and they have given you the license, then you operate through the basis of a contract. Now what is that license? Who gets to participate in that license making process? Who gives the signature? Who is the authority in participation and in legitimating that participation? I think these are the important kinds of questions that are raised in this development narrative. And ultimately then this works toward a win-win relationship, meaning the state, the owners of capital and civil society all win in this relationship by bringing about national development. So you see, this is the move in new development from a narrative of traditional developmentalism or neoliberal developmentalism in this sense, both of which argue about the tension between the state and the market. And the argument that perhaps emerges from this is that the state and the market are not in opposition with each other. The state and the market can work harmoniously, can work together along with civil society. And in fact, the idea perhaps that gets juxtaposed here is when the state, market and civil society work all together, we can bring about the new development. So within this backdrop, then I will use the Vedanta development story, which is what Samarendra will be talking about in much of his work, particularly in terms of the resistance work that is going on. I will sort of frame this in terms of looking at the Vedanta development story from the narrative of the company, Vedanta. Now, Vedanta is a multinational mining giant that was incorporated in 2003, right, Samarendra? And since 2003, it has emerged in a large way within the Indian narrative of development. One might say that it perhaps is the major player in the mining story within the context and backdrop of India. The owner of Vedanta, Anil Agarwal, is the top 10 richest British men, right? Yeah. Top 10 billionaires in Britain. And his size of the company also puts the company as one of the largest mining companies within the context of India. So you think 2003 and now we are looking at 2011. So this is a very short movement. In terms of growth and also in terms of taking up the discursive space within the narrative of development in India. Now, Samarendra will talk about the resistance in the communities to the mining operations that are being forged by Vedanta. What I will look at is what are the kinds of narratives and pictures that Vedanta cultivates. What is this new development story as told by Vedanta? So, for Vedanta, corporate social responsibility, the organization Vedanta taking up responsibility for participating in responsible business is the instrument of development. And how then is development forged about? Through mining. So this is an important link. You see, the idea of CSR here is not that you carry out CSR and then you give to the development sector as part of your CSR. But here the idea that is formulated, and this is a powerful idea, is that your very product and the commodity, the material or the materiality that you participate with, that you exchange with, is the instrument of development. So in that sense, your business entity, your business presence, your business transaction is itself development. So in that kind of a construction, then corporate social responsibility can be thought about broadly as the existence of the corporate as a function of social responsibility, as an enabler of social responsibility toward development. So Vedanta then articulates its logics in terms of creating a new India. Vedanta envisions itself as a mining giant that has a responsibility toward creating a new India. Part of creating this new India is investing in, for instance, the promise of one of the largest universities in the world that would be comparable to Harvard and MIT, putting in how many $billion? $1 billion. $1 billion. And he says that this can happen in a very short span of time. Of course, Samarendra will tell you there is no $1 billion to be seen. When you actually follow the money trail, there is simply talk about that. But part of this then is through energizing of education, energizing of the infrastructure, and really contributing to building of the infrastructure of the new nation. So Vedanta creates a new India through mining. So if you sort of unpack this logic, there are sort of 5 key elements that emerge in the Vedanta documents. These are through my analysis of annual reports of Vedanta and the sustainability indicator reports that the organization publishes. One is it says that it contributes to development in its vision of development by generating resources. It says that by translating raw materials into products and by mining these raw materials, it contributes resources. And through these contribution of resources, it therefore works toward creating a new India. It builds an infrastructure of a new India by investing in these resources, simultaneously investing in basic resources like education, food, public health, housing. We will see some of these narratives, how those play out. As it generates resources and creates infrastructures, it goes about empowering communities. And how does it do so? It does so through participation. It does community consultative processes, community participatory processes. So if you really look at the Vedanta narrative, you would come away thinking that the organization is a cutting-edge organization that innovates in participation. Participation itself becomes an innovation. The organization consults communities, has consultative processes that are set out through which organizational decisions are made. And through these processes of empowering communities, it builds sustainable relationships. So in this sense, social capital is generated by the capital that flows through the mining work of Vedanta, and this social capital then works toward building robust communities, which then further work toward generating additional resources. So you see, the conceptualization of community fits within the articulation of the organization as a generator of resources, as a generator of materiality, as Samarendra would put it. Community and community participation is intertwined with this notion of materiality, this notion of mining of resources that are then contributing to the community and that are also sustained on the basis of a robust community.
Sorry, what do they mean with robust community?
A robust community is a community where children are healthy, where children participate, they have economic opportunities, and ultimately they can find jobs in Vedanta mining companies. So you create this cycle, you create this chain of newly empowered citizens that have now come to participate in the development rhetoric and in the language of development by their participation in Vedanta mining. So this is a great point indeed, because then this becomes sort of the Vedanta campaign, which is development as happiness, right? So this is the new form of development as Vedanta envisions. It is development as happiness. It works toward creating a happy India. Launched in April 2012, Vedanta Khushi, Khushi is the term for happiness, is a social media campaign and forum created to promote awareness of issues pertaining to underprivileged children with a focus on their nutrition, education, health, and overall development. The campaign uses a blog to actively engage youth. So it says that its corporate social responsibility in that sense is carried out through its Facebook and social media sites, through which it actually participates in cultivating a youth, in cultivating engagement among the youth, and in teaching them citizenship. So the citizenship that is taught to the next generation of Indians is taught within this logic of development as happiness. So creating happiness, the title of the campaign, is an integrated campaign that has at its core the vision of contributing to building sustainable communities, teaching youth how to participate in creating sustainable communities, and in integrating sustainability as a core part of the business. So again, it connects the business to the community. The business, by integrating sustainability, also teaches community members in how to contribute to building sustainable communities. It also performs an educational role. The authorities insist that this is not a mere CSR initiative, that rather it is a means of telling people what the Vedanta group has done for the community in the past. Now this becomes really interesting because this is framed within the language of engagement and participation. But it also gives away what the nature of participation is. What is the nature of participation as it is articulated here? Its job is to tell people what the Vedanta group has done for the community in the past. That doesn't look a whole lot like participation. That looks like dissemination or diffusion of information. Seljam Rajsekar, Director of Communications and Brand for Vedanta Group, says, we have several compelling stories to tell about the work that is being done in the areas of community and sustainability. This work is bringing about change and empowering our society. Our aim is thus to tell the world the Vedanta story. And this really gives a way, so participation becomes an avenue for storytelling. And this is something that you will see in most CSR campaigns today, as large corporates are trying to figure out how to engage with social media and forms of participation in social media. The rhetoric that has arisen out of this narrative is one of storytelling. So we'll hear the buzzword digital storytelling. Organizations are interested in how to tell their stories digitally. And for Vedanta, this story can be told digitally through the framework of participation. So, how are these participatory stories created? This is powerful. So what Vedanta does is, for the youth in these film institutes and communication and journalism institutes in India, it creates a competition among the youth. It puts them in groups of 3 and tells them that you can go to one of the 150 Vedanta villages that Vedanta has adopted, and you can use participatory technologies like photo voice and video voice and participatory cameras and work with the people to tell the Vedanta story and what really happiness means for these people. Now, of course, you also have a film director that is put in place to train these students, and one of the radical film directors of India, Shyam Benegal, is part of this training institute. So you see how the language of radicalism, things like photo voice, video voice, participatory camera, all become part of the development logic of Vedanta and its neoliberal expansion. So I think this is a very powerful point, which also highlights this idea that you cannot look at a technology or a means as participatory in and of itself without looking at what the broader agendas are. So then what Shyam Benegal does is that he goes in, and he's known for making films on poverty and the plight of the poor in the 70s. He was sort of the leader of avant-garde alternative and parallel cinema. And he becomes sort of the instrument for training these college children that go into these villages and capture these stories to articulate what Vedanta has done. So a large part of the campaign is a first of its kind competition for India's young filmmakers. So part of this is also investing in the communication art and alternative and parallel art infrastructure. And I think this is a very powerful point to note, which is sort of the logic of development as it emerges in a new aesthetic. So what is that new aesthetic? The aesthetic as it constituted in the materiality of mining as a narrative of development. Each film was made by a group of 3 students across the various states, going to 550 villages and focusing on issues such as women's issues and issues of the girl child. Spoken in a cinematic language, and through which then the participants get to narrate and tell their story. So one of the points that is made here is that these stories are not Vedanta stories. This is not CSR for Vedanta. This is not the PR of Vedanta. These are stories as told by the people in the communities and as told by the youth that are working with these videos. So that is the discursive move that is made here. So Rajsekhar explains, with the film competition, we opened up all our projects and locations to budding independent filmmakers. So there is also this notion of porosity and transparency and movement with communities, so that you have to open up your organizational boundaries so that communities can come in and co-participate with you. The brief given to teams was simple: visit our locations, see our community work, find a story and make a film. The idea was to enable them to experience it firsthand and make films on impact that the projects were having on the community. And of course this was participatory because the students were not given any script to tell. The 38 films will now be judged in 2 categories: popular choice and jury award. So what is the popular choice? These films will be posted on YouTube and then on Facebook, and people could vote. That too brings about additional participation through new materiality, new media, right? And all these films are also open for public viewing and voting on YouTube. In addition, you have a jury comprising of Piyush Pandey, who is the National Creative Director of Ogilvy India, Shyam Benegal, filmmaker, and Gul Panag, an actor. So you see the complicity of media, but not just media. This is not your traditional mainstream media. This is also your radical alternative media that becomes complicit and in fact instrumental in this development story. So the first video we will capture is Binno's story. This is sort of Vedanta's happiness campaign. Binno becomes the center stage of this campaign, and that were real parents, friends, doctors and school teachers, while highlighting the changes that have transpired in rural India by looking at Binno's story. Over the years, thanks to Vedanta, the film shows how our life is different from that of our earlier generations. Do you catch something? Vedanta makes a difference in Binno's life compared to earlier generations. Binno now lives differently compared to earlier generations. Huh? When was Vedanta created?
2003.
2003. 10 short years. And we have a new India compared to the other generations, right? The campaign is extremely close to my heart as it's all about enabling India. I have worked on this campaign along with my team as an excited young copywriter, and I look forward to the people of India to not just appreciate Vedanta's efforts, but also get inspired to do something on their own to make India a happier place. So you can come participate with the Vedanta story to make India a happier place. So what does Binno's happiness look like? The first thing is Vedanta talks about is that it brings about education to Binno. It educates her. In the short 10 years that it has been in India, it has changed the landscape of these villages by being education. So we will interrogate that claim in terms of what really happens here.
ये है इस छोटे से गांव की छोटी सी बिन्नो।
Can I turn on subtitles? JT can come here.
इसके माँ बाप ने शायद अपने बचपन में स्कूल देखा भी ना। ये है बिन्नो के दो भाई, कोष्टू और नंदू। बचपन में इनके पिताजी के भी दो भाई थे, पर वो रहे नहीं। ये है गोश्तों का छोटा सा खिलौना। इसके पिताजी के पास न तो एक खिलौना था और न ही बिजली। बिन्नो के पास एक प्यारी सी मुस्कान है। पता नहीं इसकी माँ के पास ये मुस्कान थी कि नहीं। बिन्नो की आंखों में बहुत से सपने हैं। इसकी माँ बाप की आंखों में सिर्फ तीन, बिन्नो, गोश्तू और नंदू। हर माँ बाप के सपने होते हैं उनके अपने बिन्नो, गोश्तू और नंदू। एक एक करके इन्हीं सपनों को हम साकार कर रहे हैं।
Okay, it's good actually that you don't have subtitles. Can you tell me what's going on here? What's the narrative? It's beautiful. It makes you feel good, makes your heart warm.
It's a very cheesy
This was created by the students.
No, this was the cornerstone. This was by Ogilvy, and then I'll show you a couple of the student ads.
So the government really loved when Vedanta and do all this affordable work.
Yeah, they're building the infrastructure of the
Yeah.
country.
The government doesn't have to bother.
Yeah, doesn't
Yeah.
save a lot.
Vedanta can go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
But
What
from the
else?
little Hindi that I can understand, I think that the language, the text is just as important now. The way it's narrated, it almost makes you feel like, wow, why did you save this person? And wow, like you were able to bring this in, this kind of a feeling that gets generated, and appreciation for maybe the company because you came in and you were able to. But it almost has this kind of a narration that's, it's quite emotional too at some level, right? It's really like it's meant to touch your heart, or maybe meant to get not a rational reaction as opposed to like feeling of maybe joy or feeling of gratefulness or whatever.
So for any of you that have watched Doordarshan, which was the Indian state-run media up until the 80s, and tell me if this resonates with you. If you saw Doordarshan run ads or public service announcements. This is made to look very much like that. Can you tell me why? This looks very much like Doordarshan's
child welfare department.
Yeah, child welfare department, you know what the government is doing, and that is a very powerful move again. Vedanta becomes the state.
It took that ground.
The scripting and the narrativizing. There is the other part of it where Binno says that, you see, Binno is now able to dream now, that her mother and grandmother weren't able to dream. In their grandmother and mother's eyes, there were only the four walls. Interesting in our discussion on feminism and Zen today, right? For our mother and grandmother, there were only the walls. But for Binno, there is a whole new world to dream about. Then saying, what could her parents imagine and dream about? They could only see 3 kids in front of them. But for Binno, she has a whole world in her hands to dream with. But there is something else important, Chiki, and I want to show that part. How does Vedanta achieve all of this? Does this have the subtitles? No, right?
No, it does not. Sorry.
How does Vedanta achieve all of this? Can we do one? Okay, this is the part that is important. So, it does Anganwadis for 1.25 lakh children. Anganwadis are these educational welfare programs, computer education, healthcare, in partnership with government and NGOs. Who actually runs Anganwadis in India? Do you know? Is it run by Anganwadis are a Vedanta innovation?
Women's self-help groups.
It's a women's self-help groups created by the state.
Women and child welfare.
Going back to the 1970s legislation, that and the healthcare workers similarly are legislated by the state in terms of community health workers. So the discursive move that is made here, first of all, is one of co-optation, and the other is one of illusion. That it takes the things that the state does. So part of Vedanta being the state and state operative is making that argument that it provides healthcare, it provides community education, midday meals. The midday meal program in India is celebrated as an example of a state-run intervention. Vedanta co-opts that as something that it does. So part of this narrativization in CSR is the shifting of the story, right? Where sort of the private sector becomes the deliverer of all these goods, while in truth or in reality, it isn't. We will watch another one. This is done by the students. It's called Swavalamban, means now these are the ones that are created, the short films created by the students.
बीमारी आने के बाद मेरे को पहले कुछ नहीं आता था और मैं धीरे धीरे सब सीख गई हूँ। मैं सीखे जो भैंसे हैं, बकरी है, सुबह उठती हूँ, 4 बजे उठती हूँ, उठ के दूध निकालती हूँ और छाछ फेरती हूँ, घी लेती हूँ, चूल्हे पे घी गर्म करती हूँ, फिर दूध गर्म खाना बनाकर मैं फिर बाड़े में जाती हूँ, बाड़े में जाके भैंस को चारा डालती हूँ, गोबर डालती हूँ, साफ सफाई करती हूँ बाड़े की में और बकरी के पेड़ से पत्ते तोड़ के लाके उसको भी खिलाती हूँ। फिर दोपहर को खेत में जाती हूँ, खेत में कटाई बुनाई करती हूँ, सिलाई जो भी खेत में काम है वो करती हूँ। 6 साल तक तो यही चलता रहा और अब हमारे गांव में ऐसे सेंटर खुल गया है, उससे हमें बहुत सहायता मिली है।
समूह बनाया जमा करा दी है। मैंने लोन लिया है, उस लोन से मैंने ये मशीन खरीदी है और वहीं हम पहले हमको वहाँ सिलाई सिखाने से हमने ये सलवार सूट सिखाया। मैं हम राजपूत है तो राजपूती ड्रेस भी सिखाई हमको, जो हम खुद भी सिल के पहनते हैं और दूसरों को भी सिल के पहनाते हैं। इससे मेरी भी आमदनी बढ़ी है।
अभी समूह से जुड़े तो हमें टेंशन भी करने का मौका मिला और दूसरे लोगों से जैसे बड़े बड़े लोगों से भी मिलने का अवसर मिला।
विवेकानंद की तरफ से हमें एक एम्ब्रॉयडरी का प्रोजेक्ट आया हमारे लिए। वो ट्रेनिंग हमें 3 महीने की चली। उस वो ट्रेनिंग में हमें 50 से 55 तरीके की अलग अलग डिजाइनें सिखाई गई थी। वो हमने पूरी तरह से सीखी और हमारी सफाई भी अच्छी थी। मन लगा कि काम किया उसके अंदर हम लोगों ने। तो इससे क्या है कि हमें बाहर से जो आवरण संस्था है उससे जोड़ा गया और वो जो कपड़ा बाहर शॉप से आता है वो कपड़ा हमारे यहाँ पे वो लोग लेके आते हैं, हमें नहीं जाने की जरूरत नहीं है। वो कपड़ा हमारे यहाँ आता है और हम लोग कसीदा निकालते हैं, काम करते हैं। तो आप साड़ी पे है या सूट पे है, तो कुशन कवर है, टेबल कवर है, इससे भी करते
So what is this narrative? What are some of the key points here?
Entrepreneurialism, individual.
Entrepreneurialism, women, Vedanta teaching women how to participate in the economy through entrepreneurialism. That also is the logic of the market, of course, right? So I think about, we were talking about Grameen, the whole Grameen Bank innovation in terms of cooperative banking and local banking, and working within that logic of the market and participation in the market as self-help groups. What else? There is something else though.
Well, I don't know what you're thinking, but this idea we created.
Vedanta created self-help groups, right? So that becomes a Vedanta innovation.
Yeah, 250 groups and how many?
3,000 somewhere.
5,000 plus something.
Which is
We
probably
created-
the statistics.
So did they like go around and say you come out and I mean like this idea of also creating in a community, not only that it's attributed to themselves, but then to go into what happens to community, actually think about community participation, right? The idea of being able to, I don't know, just the idea of creative just gives me.
Are you making the point that they didn't think of the idea, or are you making the point that the women created these groups?
Both, and also that even the creation of the groups works within a particular ideology, which is the ideology of self-help, as it constructs local participation and grassroots participation.
And I kind of, I don't know, maybe just picked up on the change in the tone in terms of the video. So at the beginning, it was like she was so rushed to talk about all the things she was doing, all the struggle, everything. This fast pace, like, oh my God, and then all of a sudden,
And then they were happy, right?
I have to slow down, life is so, and I have control, kind of, in terms of the language, right? The tone, it just gives you this sense like, oh, now life is settled, and she's okay, and she has control. Before it was like, just.
Is there language Hindi? Look like
It's a Marwari.
But yeah.
Marwari, Rajasthan. And
Rajasthani.
And that's the place actually where Vedanta's worst CSR, you can say worst community affected villages. Because they have plundered this whole area with zinc and silver and
Zinc.
mining and all those mining related.
Yeah, I
And
think
the
what is-
Anganwadi is there, actually the ones who are leading the Anganwadi protest in India. This one and Karnataka.
It's very interesting what is not shown.
Yeah, so did the students pick up on the other stories?
That's the part. So is it participatory? What kind of participation, and what are the kinds of, what are the kinds of lenses that the students are
And where
brought
do the
into?
students stay? That's also important. The students just have fly-by-night operators. They just go to this Vedanta's guest house and they stay, and they're all very constructed stories.
They're looking
not,
for a
not
story.
really legitimate, not real research done by students, but
It seems to me that the story is not necessarily like untrue,
No.
right? But it's a very
But it's
a
particular
very
story.
And that's always been the, in my classes when I talk about research, qualitative research, people have an issue with it. And I usually make a differentiation between journalism and qualitative research. If you're a journalist, pardon me if you're a journalist, but you want to tell a sensational story. So you want to tell a story that is sensational, that will get attention. But presumably if you're doing research, you don't pick and choose certain stories. You try to tell the full, as much as you can, the fullness of the story. So what's not there, it's and the constructed nature of they went there to find a story that fit with what they were looking for is maybe what's something as well.
Which ties into the idea of what were the students told. It's not like that they were probably given a camera and said go find a story. It's probably like these are the scope within which you find a story, which already lays out what kind of stories you look for.
It is
Very
participatory.
interesting, Jeff. It was very interesting to see these students' Facebooks because I actually spied into the students' Facebook accounts. And what we found is very interesting. What they were doing there was they had fun. So they were actually revealing themselves more than even the Vedanta CSR.
Is it participatory because the students did it? Is that why?
Yes, and you're giving the cameras and giving the students the ownership of the stories.
But,
that they're taking.
but you already have the window story to aid. So if you
As
want
a
a prize, it has to come close.
Does it look like the window?
But then there are also some projects that have given the cameras to the self-help groups and let them tell the story, and then that become basically photo voice as part of the scripting that the students are doing. The other part which is interesting, and this will go back to something Ingrid you raised, which is what is the role of education in this? What is the role of universities? I could see our NUS students, us taking on a summer program, a 10-day summer program, NUS students into the Vedanta settings. They will learn about filmmaking, they will learn about communication and participatory communication, and they will contribute and build their vita at the same time. I think that's also a powerful point in terms of Indraprastha College. So what does it do for these students that they participate in this Vedanta thing? It also is a vita hit for them in terms of selling that on their vitas for particular market purposes.
There's also a diffusion, I mean, there is no more powerful and traditional symbol of diffusion in empowerment than the Singer sewing machine, going back to South America and whatever else. And,
Right?
yeah. I mean, I almost laughed when I saw the
brand also, right?
The brand as well, the Singer sewing machine. But I mean, now, do they have to get ever better sewing machines? Are they in the consumer kind of treadmill now by buying this? Do they need more and better equipment over the years?
Okay, I'll show one more, and then I want us to move on to keep building this conversation.
Can I ask you, some of the numbers that you mentioned, with healthcare and education, does some of the money actually come from Vedanta?
Yes, some of the money does come. So the part of this is Vedanta pours in the money to the NGOs and the civil society organizations. So this also becomes a powerful part of the story in terms of what is the role of these NGOs in these settings and what is the role of civil society in carrying out this development narrative. So they say it's a public-private partnership. It's a PPP.
Does Vedanta mean anything?
Vedanta comes from the Vedas, right? Vedanta. So what does it mean?
The last word of knowledge.
The last word. That's fantastic. It's a great company brand name.
Yeah, it's one of the main manuscript of the Indian religion.
Okay, let's kind of keep moving so that we sort of get through the arguments. So one is through education and the role education plays. So you saw the Swavalamban movie of an empowered community of women in Udaipur creates happiness. So at the center of this then is also this idea of art being at the locus of Vedanta's contribution to development. So it sees these films not as ad films, These are not advertising films. These are parallel cinema. These are avant-garde, alternative cinema, branded through the brand positioning of. Now I'm forgetting the name.
Sham Benegal?
Sham Benegal.
Sham Benegal,
What
right.
will clarify, I think both Sham Benegal and Gul Talan, they got out of the jury
But
after some
But
protest.
after the
After
Yeah,
the
after the
last
protest,
day
yeah.
protest.
we did a big protest and we had a
Yeah.
spoof. Do you have a spoof?
Yes.
It's interesting to show the spoof. Because what we did, we used the same image with a different narrative.
Oh,
And that was
so-
shown by more than actually the Vedanta
I
scholar.
just wondered that how come it?
This should be good. Are there some?
The real piece of Vedanta.
ये है इस छोटे से गांव की
Faking happened.
Just faking happiness.
How come a person like Sham Benegal
To do a full page
involved with
of
this kind of?
Yeah, about
But that
what
is the whole part.
education means and
I
what
mean,
elitism means.
how could he be? I mean, he's one of the leading activists during 70s and 80s from South Asia.
He's wrong. He's wrong.
I don't think this.
ये है भारत के कई आदिवासी गांवों की अनगिनत लाचार संतानें। ये बिन्नो भी हो सकती है और सुतली भी, गोश्तो या नंदू भी और शुक्रा भी। इनके माँ बाप का हक था अपनी जमीन पर जिससे पैदा होती थी खुशी। कंपनी ने जमीन छीनी, बचपन छीना और छीनी आखिरी मुस्कान भी। इनके माँ बाप ने इन्हीं जंगलों की थी रक्षा पीढ़ी दर पीढ़ी। उन जंगलों को काटा गया विकास के नाम पर। उस विकास में आदिवासियों का हिस्सा कहाँ? इनके माँ बाप के बचपन की नदियों का खुशहाल पानी आज दूषित है या गिरवी। इनके माँ बाप के पास बचपन से ही था स्वस्थ शरीर, स्वाभिमान और सपने साकार करने की हिम्मत। बिन्नू या सुतली,
Vedanta Kushi versus Vedanta ki Ganga.
Structure, but a different story.
Was it up there?
I think the third
Yeah,
one.
it's with the first one, is it?
भाई ये आदिवासी लोग का जंगल पहाड़ है, उनका बाल्टी उनका रस्सी ये एक्टिंग करवा रहे हैं।
छोटे से गांव की
कोई भी बच्ची को बोलो तो हंसी, ये बच्चे लोगों से नाटक करवा रहे हैं। दौड़ो बोलो तो सब बच्चे दौड़ने लगते हैं। पब्लिक हैरान है कि ये सब हो क्या रहा है। इन सब का गाँव वालों का जमीन धोखे से ब्रिटेन का कंपनी बजाता ने लिया
अपने बचपन में
और झूठ का नाटक करके सबको बंदर बना रहे। ये सब भाड़े की पब्लिक है, सब झूठ है।
ये है बिन्नों के
बेचारे लोग को खाने को नहीं है, इधर कंप्यूटर दिखा रहे। सब जंगल पानी छीन के गरीब लोग को मार रहे हैं। गवर्नमेंट में आदिवासी लोग को जबरदस्ती जमीन छीन कर मार रहे।
ये है दोस्तों का
क्योंकि जंगल पहाड़ में हीरा, लोहा, एल्यूमिनियम, कोयला, खनिज भंडार भरा है।
जी के पास न तो एक
पब्लिक को चूतिया बनाकर वेदांता इंडिया को चूना लगा
खिलौनों के पास एक प्यारी सी
बेचारे लोग बेघर हो गए और ये लोग झूठ मूठ का हैप्पीनेस बकवास कर रहे हैं। हजारों लोगों को गोली मारकर मरवा दिया। ये सब बच्चों का फ्यूचर का अंधेरा कर देगा वेदांता। खेती बाड़ी जमीन जिंदगी नहीं रहेगा तो हैप्पीनेस क्या घटता रहेगा। एडवर्टाइजिंग एजेंसी को पैसा दो तो कोई भी चीज बेच सकते हैं। ये बेशरम लोग उल्टा सीधा दिखा रहे हैं, उधर खून का होली हो रहा है, पब्लिक मर रही है। आदिवासी लोग को मार मार के उनका जमीन जबरदस्ती छीन रहे हैं और इधर बोलता है क्रिएटिंग हैप्पीनेस, साला झूठ है।
So you have to translate
Oh
this.
God, that's fantastic. I mean, every time I see it, it's like 1,000 times you see.
I
And
could-
then another one about the
But first translate it for us.
Yes.
What does it say?
it starts with this, that if you give a chocolate to a kid and then you ask them to run, they will run. So this is how they have filmed it. And then if you look at this, all these baltis and all these ropes they are using, they are all people's hired by people, and they have been paid to do this. And very good acting they are doing, because they don't know that this is fun for them as well. Somebody has come to film them, and they are making fool of us. That all these government run programs, they are showing as if they are running it for decades. But there were no Vedanta before this. So how can they make fool for how long? And they were making fool of everything. And it ends with that.
And then they say that they are paying an advertising agency to
manufacture. And then they
Yes.
talk about how they pay this. Anybody who is a pay master who knows all these things will do this for anyone.
Yeah, but they don't. That even this in this village, nobody haven't seen any computer in their life, and whatever they are saying is all lie. Yes, it was the last sentence.
Yeah. Also, they are all the fake programs.
Right, fake.
All about how fake program. Even they are not existing on ground, and they are talking about computers.
Right.
And if you pay the pay masters, they will talk anything.
Right.
1.25 like, what a sham.
So what is the next one?
Next one. So we did an international everywhere. Attracting good students who could also make films for us. So we also did a parallel in London, in India, and in Zambia and other places, in Trinidad and Iceland and other places. Also we created a lot of faking happiness. And they were seen by more people than actually Vedanta CSI. It just crashed. Because we also did a petition campaign, e-petition campaign, which was signed by more than 400,000. And now there is another one going on. Please go ahead with more on that and the TV thing.
And I will wrap up so that we have a chance to hear your more exciting stuff. So the next argument is the notion of empowerment. So this is the newest avatar of Vedanta's work, which is Our Girls, Our Pride, the Kushi campaign, and that takes women's empowerment specifically as the way to do it. So that is Priyanka Chopra, and she's the brand ambassador to fight the main problem surrounding the girl child in India today: nutrition, education, health, feticide and infanticide. So this happens through, again, the idea of participatory development, getting NGOs to participate in empowering women. So this is the launch, and this is powerful. So I captured this from their Facebook page, and this really brings out what is the confluence in this narrative of development. So that is Anil Agarwal.
This was launched on the final day of the referendum when they launched. That's also very interesting.
That is very interesting.
On August 19th, they launched this program when we were actually having a referendum. And the last referendum, last village, which was actually voting, Vedanta.
Said no to Vedanta.
Say no to Vedanta. And they lost around 404 people participated in this over 2 months. That was the last day, and they knew that they are going to be completely driven out by this.
Right.
So 234 women voted, and 149 or 169, I think, men voted. All voted no. So they didn't even get one vote, which was their CSR model village according to their website and according to all the YouTube you see. So all those stories about. So they launched it too. And they also created NDTV, also went to the ground, to the 12th ground Sabha, and they made another documentary as well, parallel, to showing the other side. So they became the activists, and they became also the participants.
Co-partner, the co-brander. So this is very powerful because with Anil Agarwal, you have Priyanka Chopra here, you have two women's organizations, two largest women's organizations in India, and then you have Pranay Roy.
Yes.
So, and who is Pranay Roy? He is sort of thought of as, who would be a CNN equivalent in Anderson Cooper, right? Would that be sort of that revolutionize the privatization of Indian television by launching these investigative journalistic shows? So this is also interesting in terms of, so we talked about art, now think about investigative journalism and reporting and mainstream media and how they are complicit in this narrative of development in cultivating a narrative. And it is also here that you can take the Tehelka story. But I think you have another radical news organization doing the Art Fest and the Lit Fest and the Think Fest, right?
Think Fest, Lit Fest and Art Fest.
Mohan, I think what's so difficult is such a desire to, you know, in the US we had this compassionate conservatism a long time ago, but to make compassionate this idea, you know, capitalism, we have such a desire, such a need, all the liberal, you know, sort of Westerners, to do that. And so this is a story that we want to believe, you know, this idea that it can be participatory, that yes, there are some trade-offs, but we can have, you know, we can pay for it, you know, by having education and women's empowerment. And it is so powerful that we ignore and want to look past all of these things, you know. And so that's the space that it's operating in, is this real desire to have a compassionate kind of capitalism.
And I think, Jeff, you said something powerful, that appeal is not just an appeal to America or the West. That is also the appeal to the Indian middle class. Yes. This is exactly what the Indian middle class wants. You know, Satyameva Jayate, Amir Khan, you know, this is again a radical actor, right, who takes 12 episodes and each episode is about fighting a social ill in India. And how does he do it? So he takes dowry, female feticide, all these hot button issues. And how does he bring them up? By bringing NGO actors, community participants. But who is sponsoring it? Satyameva Jayate?
Star?
Reliance.
Reliance, yes.
So again, that is again a major corporate giant that also owns television and media spaces.
I see a parallel between what you're saying about the Harvard Fences, you know, the Protestant ethic and the rise of capitalism, as opposed to the eugenics of the far-right conservative liberalism. And that philosophy really fits very well with Vedanta philosophy.
Yeah. And like the Indian middle class aspirations.
Like Satyameva Jayate, or what Vedanta is actually reflecting, what Vivekananda, Swami Vivekananda, when he went to the West, he actually he propagated the philosophy of Vedanta, and he criticized Indians and Indian society from inside. And this Satyameva Jayate was exactly doing the same thing, criticizing all the negatives of the Indian society, like NDTV, like Vedanta companies, CSR programs, criticizing India's women and the gender disparity and all those things. It is like appropriating.
And the solution is civil society through CSR programs.
We have in Western, our heritage and history, a kind of a parallel as well, where we sold indulgences, to wash away our sins.
Yeah.
And that's what basically you're doing by exposing all of these things. Yeah, you pay for it. You sort of reap in the rewards. And you know that it's sponsored by Vedanta or some big company, but you hope to pay, you hope to balance the scales, if you want to use a sort of that analogy, that capitalist analogy, and you want to pay away your sins by doing these good CSR type things.
So part of this is, go ahead.
Jeff, your compassionate capitalism and this example kind of really doesn't go so well together, right? To me, this is a beautiful example of corporate social irresponsibility. Because if you go all the way back to what you spoke about, license to operate and sustainability, living in harmony with your local communities, if that is corporate social responsibility, obviously Vedanta has failed there, right? So this is not CSR, but it's definitely just corporate social responsibility.
But
there's no sustainability for Vedanta. There's no harmony in living in harmony with community.
And no license to operate.
And there's no license to operate.
Right. And what I will argue, Ganga, is that is precisely the point. That it is by using that language of CSR that Vedanta enters this space, making a mistake, but also it is strategic, right? It enters into this space to re-articulate the new narrative of development. So if you think about the current debates in India about liberalization, right, and about corruption and the next elections, it's really interesting because the elections are, the election coverage and the conversations are filled with this idea of corruptions. But whom do these media hold accountable for being corrupt? Politicians. Individual politicians. They don't look at the corporate houses. And so that is part of cultivating the picture that the corporate houses. So you can take the same thing, I would argue, and do it with the Tatas, which is a much more hallowed CSR organization, and say that they introduce CSR within this narrative to articulate this vision of development, which doesn't really fit with the actions, don't fit with the rhetoric.
I mean, the primary target audience for these campaigns is not the tribal, they are the
It's
middle
the middle
class.
class.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And therefore, because they don't want to hear them.
Absolutely.
If they get the middle class push and all the CSR is directed towards them, then they can, get into police.
And what is powerful is that the same TV that is showing this, how tribal women are being empowered, the next frame in the news story is India is invested into 3.5 million rupees right now into purchasing drones that are going to be deployed in these tribal areas to fight the tribals. You see? And so both of these narratives, they work side by side for middle class Indians. So if you ask them, okay, so what's going on with these drone attacks? What will be their response? That is okay, because you're fighting tribal resistance, you're fighting the Maoist guerrillas.
People don't want development.
Right, and at the same time, you want to bring about this kind of development. So I want to show, there's also a notion of celebrity cause sponsorship, right? So here in this case you have Shah Rukh Khan. Do you know who Shah Rukh Khan is?
Everybody knows Shah Rukh Khan.
Isn't that the bad
You know?
line?
Isn't that the word?
Isn't that the bad line? That's the circle of line.
You know this, my name is Khan.
Jim, do you know Shah Rukh Khan?
I don't. I was making a joke of my ignorance.
Oh, my name is Khan, I'm not a terrorist.
No, I'm not a terrorist is not the title of the film. Just my name is Khan.
My name is Khan, I'm not a terrorist.
You should watch something.
Yeah, see, he's a famous Indian
It
actor.
takes on the Western notion of Islamophobia and recognizing this as a way of preempting that.
I'm not a
Like
terrorist.
was meant that.
I'm just an Indian.
Okay, so let's watch him.
I gotta watch it.
It was very famous in the Middle East countries.
Targeting the Middle Eastern audience.
That's the guy. That's not what we're watching.
That's not what we're watching.
No, that's the guy. Yeah, they're trying to contextualize.
I think girl child issues हमारे देश में बहुत सारे हैं. We have lot of negatives and areas which can be improved. And I think it's a wonderful campaign. I think it's a wonderful move by NDTV to be participating in something like this. And I want everyone to come forth and give ideas, not only give ideas, participate in any programs that may happen which will make people aware of the issues of the girl child.
It's interesting that you said NDTV.
Yes.
Yes.
That's the one who actually is
They are sponsoring, so
brand
NDTV becomes
ambassador
is the
for
face for
Vedanta.
this. Okay, let's go through this so that we can. So part of this language then is the language of sustainable development. This is how Vedanta then frames what it does. So what does it say? By ensuring that a business produces resources responsibly is not only crucial for society, it is critical for sustaining the growth and development of our business. All of us at Vedanta believe that we can strengthen our business and positively impact the world by managing all our business operations sustainably. By doing so, we maintain constructive and mutually respectful relationships with all our key stakeholders. So this is important, the language of stakeholders, relationship, relational harmony, and sustainability, right? So sustainability becomes the buzzword through which Vedanta gets its license to operate, because it does businesses sustainably. Right, so how does it become sustainable? It uses state-of-the-art technology, and we are committed to embracing and developing new technologies and innovations that add economic value, create efficiencies, and also make a significant contribution to reducing the environmental footprint of our business. This is powerful, you know. Yesterday, was I telling you, I was at the talk of the World Aviation Congress. So, you know, when they invited me to give a keynote, I said, oh, I will go. You know, this is a great opportunity to disrupt. So I talked about CSR and authenticity, you know, how you say something and you do something and how they are so different. And immediately they responded, you know, but we are really trying to do things. We are really trying to reduce our carbon footprint, and look, these are our data. So there, I think, was something that becomes very powerful in that is this notion of developing new technologies and innovations. So part of the license to operate and that sustainability language is that you create new efficiencies and create value by building innovations that reduce the environmental footprint of the business. Does that really bear out in the actions? Does that really bear out in what we actually see in terms of the environmental footprint? That's the question, right? But in this narrative, the other part that you see is that there is no presentation of evidence. If you have reduced the footprint, how, you know, looked at the sustainability report and was examining it closely, and there are no articulations of how and where and what kind of impact. So,
but even if, right? Okay, so you reduce the footprints from 100% pollutants to 99% pollutants, so like big deal. This is the problem with all of these green technologies. But in the end, there's no like green car, it still pollutes.
Yes.
Yeah. It doesn't say anything about that.
So in that sense, I guess it is, you also have to question what really is an innovation, right? Because if you continue to innovate, would you exist as an organization? If Vedanta really innovates, what would it be its value? That's a powerful question, right? Because if part of the innovating and reducing the environmental footprint is really being committed to the environment, what would that translate into? Let me give you another example. You know, when Coke says we want to prevent obesity, we want to fight obesity, what would you tell Coke? I was asking my undergraduates, what would you tell Coke?
Stop producing it.
Stop producing it. Right? So Vedanta should actually, if it is committed to sustainability, it should run itself out of business. Go ahead.
This is something we have come to over and over again, that it requires Vedanta, or for that matter, not just Vedanta, there are lots of human rights violations, but for that even other socially responsible mining companies. Why are they there? For a reason, right? And then we always come to this saying, oh, we need to reimagine alternative futures. But we never get around to reimagining those futures.
Don't we though? I think those futures are being, outside of this development story, I think many of these futures are already being reimagined.
Well, that would be an answer.
I think that is an answer. If you look at all the various forms of grassroots cooperatives, grassroots forms of organizing that are existing out of this, outside of this sphere. But I think that's a powerful point.
Arundhati Roy, in her one of her work, where she walking with an oasis, says that, can we keep all the minerals in the mountains? Can we call that development?
Bauxites in the ground.
Yeah,
but that's actually from oil in the soil.
Yeah.
There's a campaign going on in Nigeria, we call that, let the oil be under the soil, because the soil is polluting and it's devastating the organic community. So also bauxite in the ground, let the bauxite be in the mountain.
Mm-hmm.
That's how it ends. Or is saying that what you're working on.
That's reimagining.
So part of sustainable engagement then is this picture, right? Happy farmers surrounded by greenery, farming and contributing, and Vedanta contributes to this. Now think about the business operations. What does Vedanta do? And I think again that is very interesting. Vedanta builds mines, right? And then it builds distilleries to process the raw materials. So if Vedanta were to go into this community and build a mine, what would this picture look like this? Would it look green? And I think that is the power of visual rhetoric. So when we think sustainability, we look at these green images, happy farmers, oh, Vedanta is sustainable. But if you really interrogate what's inside that storytelling, does this visual rhetoric go with the actual practices of Vedanta and what it does? And I think that kind of critical interrogation is really important and needed. So important doing business through stakeholder engagement, and this again gives away. See, an important part of the Vedanta sustainability framework is the group social policy, which is supporting technical standards, which provide structure to the way we manage a stakeholder engagement. These standards require all operations to identify stakeholders, determine engagement plans, including recording and responding to stakeholder inquiries and grievances. Our stakeholder engagement standard is aligned with international best practice and equips our subsidiaries to have a consistent approach to the way they engage and communicate with their stakeholders. So I would say, and I agree with Samarendra, your notion of physicality, that you have to physically be in the spaces to see how this translates. But I would also say that if you critically read this statement, it gives away its inconsistencies. The inconsistencies of this logic are built into its articulation. How?
Can I add one thing?
Yeah.
You know, what is engaging with this? It's engaging with a very good PR company to write all these reports. For the first time, they have followed world's #1 diversified company, BHP returns methods of CSR. No mining company has ever come up with a sustainable development report saying that mining is sustainable. So they have been trying to actually create a new language, and they funded around $33 million to produce a report called Breaking New Ground. And if you look at these words, the words are plagiarized by those reports. We have been analyzing the semantics of this language and the chronemics and the proxemics of how they are actually arranging the time and the space and where they are doing it. Because no company has ever started SDR. So they are hiring the experts. The one who is writing this, you know who he is. He was actually with the Shell company. So they are hiring the best experts on CSR writing.
And what I'm saying, Samarendra, is that even if they are doing that, their faulty logic, if you analyze this, their faulty logic becomes evident. Because what is sustainability and what is engagement? It is about identifying stakeholders. Why would you want to identify stakeholders? Question one. If you think about basic principles of management, right? Why would you want to identify stakeholders? What do you want to do when you identify stakeholders?
So you build them a sustainable environment.
So that you can, through your product, through whatever it is that you are delivering, A. B, determine engagement plans, including recording and responding to stakeholder inquiries. Why do you record and respond?
That's very important, because that's what actually BHP Billiton has on record has said when it came to Orissa and it failed the project. So it hired Oxfam. So one of the world's best known brand, Oxfam and BHP Billiton, they started to implement a community corporate leadership project in Orissa, where they were driven out by the community. So they said engaging creates, I'm quoting, engaging creates enormous amount of data for surveillance.
So there is a surveillance function where you are recording and then responding strategically. So when I teach my PR students, this will be what? You're gathering the surveillance data to strategically respond. Yeah. So is that participation? What kind of participation is that? Within what kind of framework? Whose purposes does it serve? Let's go a little bit further. So the key stakeholders are communities. How do they define communities? Vital to the business's license to operate. What are governments in their definition? Governments provide a regulatory framework, taxation, licensing, infrastructure, economic playing field for growth in which the business exists. Partner in infrastructure development projects. This goes back to the development narrative, right? So the government is a partner in infrastructure development. And who is civil society? They provide a critical eye to the business's operation, provide technical support to the learning and development of the business. This is, I think, very telling. What are NGOs here for? You know, I say this and please don't quote me. NGOs are all bastards. and I think part of that is that
I'm going to quote you.
You know, they are completely participants in this form of exploitation and in this kind of erasure. They are the co-partners by co-opting that language of creating change, building change in communities.
So you know what is very interesting, that all the mining companies have got a name for the stakeholder participation exercise. They're called building partnerships for development. The only thing NGOs have added is that building partnerships for social development. So BPD has become BPSG for the NGOs and BPD is for the corporates.
So they provide a critical eye to the business operation. What does that mean? That NGOs are the ones that are doing the groundwork in the field in terms of gathering the data, collecting the information, doing the surveillance function, and then being the wing for the organization in the community, hidden often in the form of doing social good. What were you going to say?
So is this a language that they're using that comes from some text?
This comes from their texts. That's what I'm saying. So their texts give away if you closely read their text. And then they say they provide technical support to the learning and development of the business. What does that mean? NGO is another wing of the business. They're providing them with technical support and infrastructure to build the business and do better. You know, this is, I will give my cynical view. When I was growing up as a child, I would see the people that would run the NGOs, every family that ran an NGO, they would have a car, a socialite woman that would be going to all these settings and hobnobbing with people in the family, and then they would have access to tons of resources. And I always wondered, what are they here for? What is their purpose? What function do they serve? And I think that's a very powerful question when you think about NGOs and the idea of NGOs being altruistic, because that becomes the facade under which organizations like Vedanta get to articulate their worldview. So stakeholder engagement becomes a way for their operations to run stakeholder identification and analysis processes. And I will just go to the end. Using the information gathered, our operations can then determine with the stakeholders themselves the level of communication and consultation that is appropriate. So one of the things I did is I looked from their documents about what does a stakeholder engagement meeting look like. So who do you think sits at those stakeholder meetings? Supposedly these are taking place in communities. And these are the kinds of images they will put up in the report. It's people like you and me. Not village elders, but I guess in the Lanjigarh mining story, then they will put up the village elders. But in the CSR sustainability report, they will put up the images of people like you and me who are sitting around the table to have this conversation. We'll go through this quickly. Another part of engagement then is engaging with social media. And you see, we have an active presence on various social media to increase awareness about our business and activities, share latest news, and respond to any queries or comments that are posted on our social media sites. Vedanta has been ranked #1 among all FTSE 100 companies on use of YouTube to engage with stakeholders. So this is the idea of engagement, right? If you have YouTube and get participation on YouTube. This is the other part. So when they say, how do you respond to stakeholder engagement? Vedanta responds to stakeholder engagement by saying that we respond to stakeholders at the group, business, and operational levels as appropriate. Our subsidiary companies and operation teams on the ground are well placed to understand the needs of their stakeholders as they are in continuous and active engagement with them. And what Vedanta does is it says that it participates in these dialogues. For any email that is sent to Vedanta, it makes sure that it replies and responds. So that is its idea of stakeholder response. See, And of course, you will relate to this, Samarendra. During the later half of 2012, we received 2,497 letters from members of the public asking questions about the project in Lanjigarh, following a campaign by Amnesty International in Holland. Individual replies were sent to 1,478 people, where there was a readable correspondence address. Each response contained a copy of the report, The Lanjigarh Development Story, Vedanta Perspective. So that is dialogue. So I'm going to give you my spin, and I'm going to respond to you, I'm going to send you an email. Now think about the people in the community and on the ground who are actually facing this. Are they going to receive emails?
Or are they going to read the Vedanta's perspective? That is a response to Amnesty for the very
What was the campaign by the Amnesty?
Amnesty did 3 reports, and as a result, Vedanta responded that we hear you, we bring you to the round table. They had discussions with the company. Amnesty executives visited them, and then they had got all the answers which they were asking for. And then the company came out with a report saying that these are the things Amnesty is actually obfuscating and lying, and these are not facts that match the realities. And it was a very interesting calculated report, which this year AGM I have asked. But last year I have asked a question about Vedanta's perspective. There were many factual inaccuracies. I said, okay, you go by your own factual accuracies, and how can you say this and this and this? And then in one place they have said that we actually work with the communities and we respect, and another place they are saying that Dongriya Khons are backward communities. They are uneducated. So all those subjects they have used, I said, how can you write those adjectives which are actually racist by nature? Then they apologized me. Anil Agarwal said that I'm sorry if I hurt your sentiments, we will take it out next year, this year. So 1 year after, they didn't even delete any of those. I said, you don't bother about what you write. You have not even deleted from that website, and you have come up with more racist remarks about Dongriya Khons because you have lost the mountain. So they have this, this discourse and all these things are written by experts who have nothing to do with the company. These are desk writers based in London. The guy was a sustainable development executive for Shell company. So he knew the Shell experience. He knew actually how international campaigns he can actually run. In Netherlands and in UK they have done this very well. So he has been hired. Vedanta is hiring world's top executives on every sphere of life. For now it has taken Sam Walls from Rio Tinto as his advisor. Chief of Rio Tinto is advising me. B.H. Billiton's executive was a former chairperson of this company. So you see, world's top 3 companies, all the ex-executives are being hired by Vedanta.
Can I wrap up? So I will just wrap up with the final thing about transparency. So part of this narrative is also Vedanta articulating how it is a transparent organization. It says that they ensure transparency through group communications and investor relations teams that have access to all information, and business subsidiaries carry on the same practice of making all information available on the website and available to and again, there's the question, right? So to the Dongriya Khon, what kind of information becomes available? And I remember, you're writing about the idea that they would actually be holding the stakeholder meetings in Bhubaneswar, far removed from the Dongriya Khon communities. And that is their idea of transparency, right? So again, but to a middle class, so this is actually a website that is targeted toward the literate person that is member of the civil society, that is member of the educated class. This is a story that makes sense. Yeah, you put up stuff on the website, you make your information available, that makes you a transparent org. You can give a facade of being transparent in that sense. So ultimately then, wrapping up this story, and I want to sort of go back and sort of end here, which is this idea of development being the nexus of generating resources, creating infrastructures, empowering communities, building sustainable and robust relationships. And at the heart of this is the relationship between the state, between the mining company, and between civil society or NGO organizations.
One question I had was, this is a specific example from the mining industry, right? And extractive industries in general have a tough time with sustainable development. And that's where the reimagining future stuff comes. But when I hear you talking about partnership amongst, and so this is broader, not just extractive industries, partnerships between business, government, and civil society. There have been successful partnerships, right? So from a research perspective, when you look at the broader spectrum, like Jeff just said, it's one thing to sensationalize one story. Definitely not just Vedanta, but the entire mining sector or extractive industries, or what we call the sin sector, for instance. Cigarette company trying to get socially responsible, alcohol company trying to get socially responsible. That's a whole different set of challenges. But there are a whole lot of other companies where sharing responsibility, so to speak, is possible and happens. For instance, electrification projects, water, what we call last mile connectivity, companies that work in deserts where government connections, say water pipe connections, just don't make it to that last village. It's probably just the last couple of miles. But a company that's operating there might decide to just get into that as part of their CSR. Yes, and they do it.
See, I will use water to engage because I think water is a great place. I will say that public-private partnership, again, you might argue, and we might disagree, that water maybe is not a sin sector. I would argue that it is a sin sector because the framework of public-private partnerships, if you think about the Cochabamba water struggles, if you think about Rio Tinto again, owning up so much water and water pathways, that public-private partnership becomes a way for the private enterprise to take the water and to turn it into a private commodity and to transact
That's a different issue. That's bottling water. No, this I'm saying is laying the last bit of pipeline so that people can get water in their homes. It's about electrification, for instance.
But why should electrification be a private enterprise when the state has so many crores, if you think about India, of rupees in accumulated value? Why should that not be the realm of the state? And if a private company comes into the sector of electrification, does it then open up that sector to private economy?
It's not a robust.
Yes, indeed, because there are plenty of examples where this is a specific example of a company in the power sector that actually partnered with the government and NGOs and set up, they brought, I don't remember, it was a generator or something where, they brought in electricity to their, and this was just their corporate social responsibility thing that they tried because they don't even have operations in that area. Their center is in Delhi, but this was in Rajasthan, I think, because solar power thingy. And so they were trying to tap and bring electricity to the villages, and it worked just fine. So that, to me, is corporate social responsibility. And that's where partnerships do work. Definitely not in all cases, but whenever we talk about PPP, I think it's not all black, nor is it all white. There are shades of gray, but there are shades of gray. It's not always, example.
So there's no partnership, right? They're just going and giving solar land.
No, they can't do that. And they need to work with the government. But even education is a different story.
But same as electricity or same as access to power, why should the state not play its role in publicly securing access to electricity and making sure that everyone has, so the state has failed. Yes. In a country where you have a certain coterie of population that hold most of the resources. So in that sense, what I'm saying is the public-private partnership fits exactly into that rhetoric where it is the state failure. So you look at the, I'm doing an analysis of the McKinsey reports. And McKinsey reports are big into this because they are using precisely PPP to say that all these sectors can now be privatized because the state is a failed. Why? But if you really look at it, the Indian state, I don't think is a failed state. You see, there are sectors again within the education, the Anganwadi system. These are examples of the state enterprise where it has worked.
Exactly, Mohan. I'm not saying that it's a failed state. In fact, when I spoke to all these people who were engaged in PPP, for instance, the language they used were things like lending a helping hand plugging loopholes in the implementation. It's not taking over, or they don't want to do that. Why on earth would they want to spend their own?
Because it's a market.
And the middle class likes.
No, it's not a market.
It's not. I mean, in this case, yes, right? But not in all these cases. Education. Why on earth should a company get into a government school and supply midday meals? Why should they?
Because they need workers.
Oh, come on.
No, they have a
why
nice
would
image, right?
a specific company do that? There are plenty
Because,
of other companies
okay,
do
I
that.
have,
The government can do that.
so in my book I have a chapter on this where I would argue that you take Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, right, and World Food Fund, that it gets exactly with private companies to get into these sectors, to get into the midday meals. You know why? And you're going to laugh at this. Because that becomes the channel to co-opt that population and to disseminate through that all these, what are the DSMs called, the food nutraceuticals. Have you seen these things that are packaged? Are you familiar with that? The nutrient things. So now that is a whole new sector, where that's a sector of innovation where you have these companies that are coming out to innovate on genetic technologies and food modification technologies
They try to
through midday meals. So that's a good. So you see, I don't think I'm being too cynical when I say that this becomes a. Do you think I am?
I think to some extent I agree with Dutta that this example is very blatant, right? This is almost like a too easy target in a way. I can see it, it's very like
No, this is
upsetting
similar
and-
to another example in Kodaikanal. I don't remember the company's name. Do you remember that?
I know.
These guys who put the mercury in
Right.
the land and then grew tomatoes for farmers as part of CSR. I mean, that's obvious, right? No one in their right senses would call that corporate social responsibility, which is exactly why CSR gets such a bad reputation. In fact, all this greenwashing and all that happens. Companies are going to the extent of what they call green blushing, where they don't even talk about what they do, because when they talk, they get so criticized. And that of course happens when there's a huge disconnect between what they say and what they do, and this is clearly a case of that. In fact, the Vedanta communications chief just quit and went on a 4-month sabbatical. Poor guy, I can imagine what it was trying to do all this greenwashing that they did, right? But that in no way detracts from the fact that there are companies that are trying to do.
But what
Whereas I think that actually maybe some of the companies that seem actually quite altruistic in some way they do would make a more interesting object of criticism. Like for instance, this I can see some interesting starting point. But I think I agree that
Tata's.
that here.
So Tata's is and this is a great example, because Tata's, you look at in Singapore, and we published about that. When you look at what they did in Singapore, they were supporting the state in displacing people and carrying out worse forms of violence on people, but that doesn't fit with the image of the Tatas in what they have done with Jamshedpur and what they have done with their country.
But that would make for more interesting examples then.
There isn't a good company.
We can argue for
I agree with Mohan. Because I mean, corporate social responsibility must always be irresponsible because it always operates within the capitalistic framework. Like this is the end game. This is the bottom line. I would be the cynical one as well. As the corporate social responsibility would always entail some kind of irresponsibility.
And
It must
yeah,
be.
the back-
Temasek Holdings also.
Yeah.
Of course.
Of course.
Okay.
They do.
You know who is one of the largest shareholders in Vedanta? Do some research.
You can give
Number
the answer,
2.
I think the answer.
I'm not going to say.
No, cannot be Singapore company.
Check into it. Check into it. It just might be.
I am very surprised that the companies become more and more harsh with their employees, not allowing them to go to strike, but they are doing more and more outside. I am very skeptical about that. No strikes, no unions, so no responsibility to their employees, no health insurance policies, having part-time workers more than full-time workers, but they're doing all these kind of outside activities.
And that's a very powerful place because PPP, one place where it is entering is through schools. And you have no way of monitoring what they are doing in schools. They're going about changing curriculums, hiring and firing teachers, determining what is and what is not taught. I mean, in the US, you see the charter schools and the experimentation with the privatization of the public schools is a great example of that, right? And then with Howard Zinn, if you want to ban it, some owner of the private school comes and says, oh, I don't want these kinds of reading. These are the things that you're going to read. You're going to read Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged and Fountainhead.
I mean, midday meal schemes are a big critique because right now the midday schemes meals is that they have to cook hot food and serve. But then these biscuit companies came in and they said, we'll supply biscuits instead of hot food. And there was a lot of this backlash from some NGOs saying hot food is much more nutritious and better. I mean, there were some deaths of some school kids because of eating this food that was cooked. So in the backdrop, there was this big pushback by some like Britannia company that will supply biscuits.
Mary, do some research on, you were a journalist at one point of time. Can you do some research on Singapore Ore Exchange? What is that? Ore, O-R-E.
Oreos.
Ore. And what is that entity? You will find that, did you see the recent scam, the mining scam in India? So they're putting all these politicians in jail. Ajay Singh, right? That's the name of one of the politicians who is, and Samarendra was talking about that, who has been caught in these scams with these mining connections. You know where he was? In Singapore. What was he doing in Singapore? You should check. You should check what is Singapore's share in Vedanta. Does it have any share?
It strikes me. You know, the last time they were looking for, Temasek Holdings was looking for a CEO, and one of the incumbents, one of the candidates then, was this guy from a South Africa mining company, Charles Goodyear. So like everybody was like wondering like, how come Temasek Holdings they got mining in South Africa?
I think because they've been there in many instances.
You always think like Temasek Holdings is like SMRT, right? What's that going to do?
What has that got to do, right? That is the question. So if sort of you see this kind of a worldview, what is our role as academics, as scholars? I think that's an important question.
Make money.
Make money.
Reimagine new worlds.
Reimagine new worlds.
But if you have Vedanta, Vedanta University, how? You cannot.
Vedanta University.
What if they fund a university, then there's nothing to do about?
No, Vedanta has, I think, way too many issues to hide up with universities and stuff. Lots of human rights violations and stuff happening. So, I mean, that's basic human rights issues.
Having said that, in the initial Vedanta report, how did Vedanta come into India? They did landscape assessment and they do this cost benefit and risk analysis. Guess who were carrying those out? Professors from the Indian Institutes of Technology, professors of mining and metallurgy. And then there were other professors who were being paid by Vedanta, and who you later realize if you dig deeper that were in some way or other in some Vedanta NGO board or the other, that were writing reports about how Vedanta is a green company that's going to do for the community, it's going to generate employment. So I think there's also a powerful question about what role does academia play, what role do academics play. Some colleague was telling me that they received $2 million to do a PPP project in Zimbabwe. I'm like, okay, what are you doing exactly? And so when I asked him what is it that they're doing, and they wouldn't tell me in depth what is it exactly that they were doing. So part of these kinds of partnerships, CSR activities, is on one hand you have the language of transparency, right? On the other hand, you really don't know where money flows, where capital flows, what is the nature of capital, how does capital manifest itself?
In short, we are doomed to be poor unless we be part of academic PB.
Like one of the things you realize Vedanta does in the UK is it funds these schools, these Hindu schools. That's big as part of Vedanta's CSR. You know what kinds of Hindu schools are these? These are right-wing RSS, BJP linked Hindu schools. So if you think about that money trail, in terms of what is the money trail between these kinds of corporates and some of the fascist, right? In the context of India, the fascist right wing. And what is the space for dissent? Try telling an Indian, okay, that and in a middle class context that, you know, these minds, we really need to think critically about what is the function of these minds. What do you think would the response be? Like, where are the resources going to come from? How is the country going to develop? How is it going to build its GDP? So Arundhati Roy, as she puts it, in India, it has imagined a new kind of colonialism. In this colonialism, it is the Indian middle class versus the indigenous people, and the indigenous people are occupying the energy resources and the mineral wealth that the middle class think that they should rightly have. So they are okay, that's why, for deploying large-scale state violence on the indigenous people and frame it as a Maoist resistance. Like Samarendra will say, right, how his work has been framed as a Maoist resistance, while it's a non-violent Gandhian resistance. Ingrid, do you have thoughts?
Say again?
Do you have any thoughts? What are your thoughts?
Well, so, yeah, no, I agree actually with your critique. Yeah, I think with the part, of course, that is maybe not so much part of this particular discussion is indeed where, I think it's actually your question, where is academics, does this reimagining come in, or in what ways are we ourselves, say in an institution like NUS in Singapore, educating young Singaporeans to go abroad and be part of the NGOs, whatever, in what ways are we implicated in this kind of new form of exploitation? Through this rhetoric of participation, of activity in community. I think this is sort of a wider question that I have in general in my work also. What is the purpose also of education, and what's the purpose of me as a researcher or an academic? To what extent is our narratives of the discourses we employ, and just sort of having voices from the ground heard, and the way we conduct our research. In what ways does that corroborate to this kind of neoliberal framework?
Absolutely.
I think this is it becomes a very tricky question, not so much in terms of the critique of this type of company, which I totally agree with, this kind of critique, but it becomes an issue, I think, when you start speaking about forces of resistance and start trying to depict resistance and start maybe falling yourself in the trap of congratulating yourself with having found the sources of resistance. I think for me this is...
That can also become part of the surveillance, right?
Precisely. Yeah. Or part of that huge media landscape. I think it's really part of sort of propaganda machine.
And I was, when talking to activists or collaborating with them, I think it becomes important, and this is, my humble thought, that perhaps it becomes important to outline what your agendas are, and are they transformative or not? Are they so when you think about sociologists like Boaventura de Sousa Santos, talk about imagining another world and working with communities to sort of bring out those kinds of stories that imagine other kinds of worlds. What is the role of the academy? Because on one hand, you're right that you can collaborate within that grassroots context, but on the other hand, you can also be part of that marketing machinery that sells that story. To which Samarendra said something, and I think I find that really instructive, is that as an academic, can you be part of the capacity in solidarity with the community, where the community thinks of you as a resource. When you say, bottom up, we talk about culture-centered approach. I think when you do CCA work, easily you could see Vedanta, CCA being a part of Vedanta initiative in a community, right? Where you're listening to the voices of community, creating participatory spaces. But I think there are other examples though, like the work with women farmers, where the women farmers actively work toward imagining another kind of farming community that resists BT cotton. So I think the agendas, one has to be clear about the agendas perhaps.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. I think it's also a matter of realizing that you always have yourself at some stake. Because it's always interested, right? The research that you do. A company may have some interest, that's why CSR is always, somewhat unethical, always egoistic. I think the same is always true also for academic research. We also come there
with an
interest.
We are not neutral.
Precisely, and to sort of acknowledge that it's very tough. I think to see where the complicity of those interests lie, that is very tough not to crash. So, again, not to become too self-congratulatory, because maybe it's true that it can be both, right? You do this kind of bottom-up grassroots thing, and that in and of itself constitutes maybe part in the end of a sort of marketing or propaganda machine. This can also become, or is it the same thing? It was wonderful to talk about bottom-up or grassroots. So this, I think these things cannot so easily be split out from one another. Just as much as maybe see good companies who do some good in the country, that there is I'm pretty sure there is another side of the coin to this kind of stories, as far as academics in the same way.
Where our research is always complicit with the structure.
In what way? And even in what ways do we depict this kind of story? In what ways do we describe? And for what purposes? There's always also the purpose of ourselves, for our careers, and also the institution or the country that we work in. These would be always the kind of questions that I would force to ask myself.
And you're right, those are, I think, tough questions, very tough questions.
Yeah, because just spelling out an agenda might not capture it.
And reflexivity might not tap into it. You might say, I'm going to do my journal notes and be reflexive and make that evident. And I also think, I'm not sure to what extent as an academic I'm aware when I'm working in the community, to what extent, so I can try to enlist what my privileges are. But I'm not sure to what extent I'm aware of my own complicities. So when you imagine another world and say that we want to work in academia, because Vedanta, Samarendra was giving this kind of critique. And he was saying, I had a real letdown when I was talking to him about Vandana Shiva, and we are working on a project with, starting to converse with her about a project. And Samarendra was like, do you know what kind of branding person she is? She takes all these local community voices and turns them into the Vandana Shiva brand. And I think that was very powerful. And you should hear him talk about Arundhati Roy.
I would love that. But that's the thing, right? I mean, these people may be very well intended, but the intentions may be very sound, the way they understand it. In that way, I can totally understand that an activist, like, I forget his name, gets involved in this. It sounds really similar to the kind of activism he has been doing. The intentions may be, the heart may be in the right place, but you also have those clear good intention. And the same, I think, might be true for academics and research. It's a pity I'm missing.
Yes. And he said something, because I was having this conversation with him and saying, so what do you do as an academic once you recognize this? And you can through conversations, and conversations are a great way to make you humble in that sense, right? But what do you do with it? And he was saying that you have to be very aware of the celebrity culture, and of how we become celebrities through these processes of articulating alternatives. Manuel Castells, Giddens, Zizek. He gave a very interesting read on Zizek, for instance. He was showing how Zizek talks about the Niyamgiri movement but he hasn't traveled to Niyamgiri. He has really no understanding of the context, but he talks about it as sort of an example of an insurgent global left. And in the process, Zizek takes the Niyamgiri movement and refers to it as a Maoist movement. The same thing that the dominant structure would do. He says, I'm very skeptical, that Zizek supposedly wanted to meet him, and he said, I don't want to meet him.
This is an interesting case of personalities in a movement. How their differences can affect the movement.
And then, Ingrid, also my question is, does this tie into activists? Are activists also complicitous, even as they resist?
Yeah. It would really depend on the issue you're talking about, the situation, and the way you think about the situation. I mean, you're talking about NGOs, right? So the ways in which I've seen many feminist activists, again, with good intentions, both these NGOs, maybe in foreign countries, and actually try to empower the local brown women. And the way in which this grows can be completely implicated in the type of maybe developmental to the capitalistic rhetoric these NGOs participate in. So I've seen many activists use these type of discourses that are actually neoliberal discourses in order to empower, and also sort of neo-colonial discourses a lot. Like Stevenson's white people saving brown women from brown men. This type of discourse you find a lot with Western activists, especially going to foreign countries to help.
And with Indian activists. I mean, this is part of the Vedanta story, right? The empowering the girl, empowering the woman.
Yeah. So you see the same logic returning there. It's very problematic.
Mary, what are your thoughts?
How the narratives, right, different narratives all sort of subsume in bigger narratives, whether it's about development or national identity, new national identity. So everything all adds up. In Singapore, national education, we also have, the government also gives money and funds to use to do films. So all, it's called animation, right, using social media to promote nation building. It's something like, I just thought, yeah. And then it's supposed to be from ground up. It's just like we just celebrated our National Day. They have all the stories, 49 stories from the people. Maybe it's all, I must maybe read closer into the stories and see that maybe everything is subsumed. Or is it fair?
And then again, that's also the question of art, right? So if you do radical art and you take money from a cinema, and you take money from, what is the film board here?
MDA.
MDA, right? Right. And if they are your sponsors for the film that you make, what does it mean?
I have a question. It's regarding the activists. When you were saying activists, most of the activists somehow connected with non-governmental organizations like NGO, even remarkable people like the former president of East Timor. He was an activist. He was connected with the development agencies, and then Walden Bello of Philippines. These are remarkable people. So how could you find, if you refer to an academic activist like whatever you or Anu Mohammed in Bangladesh, or at least you can give information to the people or masses who can make you aware. Finding these kind of activists is really rare.
But also I think, I would pay attention to Ingrid's voice, and what she is saying is that should not be self-congratulatory. One should not take that into saying, okay, I am treading these spaces, so I'm like really carving out a radical space.
Yeah, and when
like Muhammad Yunus,
right,
as an academic activist, and you look at all the critiques, of Grameen
Right.
That suggests that he's very much complicit in the structure.
Right. No. We know about him. We know about him. So when he came up with the theory that he would go for politics and people didn't accept it. Doesn't matter. I mean, he did a lot of development, empowered the women, because women in Bangladesh, rural Bangladesh, could earn because of his structure. But it doesn't mean that it really empowered the women. But those women, there is a question whether those women will vote for her. They didn't agree. So he couldn't come up as a third or alternatives for Bangladesh politics. No. So thus people can give the verdict. But thing is that who will show the right way or wrong way? If he is, I mean, NGO have their funding agency agenda. So if I'm an activist with some NGOs, it is Swedish, Canadian or US funded, I could say this much, I couldn't say that much. I was affiliated with one regional organization, and these organizations were not ready to make any statement about human rights violation about any specific community in Burma, because that doesn't fit in the agenda of the funders, although they are activists. So within this reality, I mean, how much people could merge with who is a real activist?
And what are the agendas?
Right.
I will give you one story and I'll make it quick. So, you know, in my work with the Santalis, there's this one village that sort of, for the last 5 years, has been the site of Maoist resistance. So the government has curfews at different points of time in terms of who enters, who doesn't. The last few times that, you know, we have been working on a community project, the community members said, would you come with me to our local community site? This is like a large piece of land that is owned by the Santalis. So Santalis have this idea of collective land. So this is a piece of land that was owned by the Santalis. And what has happened now is that that piece of land has been taken over by a private person that owns most of the property in the area, so it's land shark. So, you know, we went to look at that place, we were taking pictures, immediately some guards came and they're like, hey, what are you doing? You get out of here immediately. But while we were getting out, what we saw are some big placards, tinted placards. So I'm like, what are these? Let's look at these. So I turned one of these, and it's a huge sign that says Swedish Women's Organization and Self-Help. So then I asked, you know, the community organizers coming with me, what is this? And so then he started narrating the story that this community land was the Swedish NGO came in with funding and gave the funding to this family that had a land sharks, to the wife of the family, to run an NGO. That's why I say the bastards, right? To run that NGO, local NGO to teach women to sew. Like the whole single direct and generate money that way. And then they said what happened is, after that happened, nothing happened, they took up the land, they got everyone's signature in the community, and then they took the land. And then they said, when nothing was happening, they went to the person and they said, what's going to happen, why are you not giving this back to us, because this is community land. And he said, well, we will build a hospital. And again they came and they took signatures, they brought in another funding agency and they showed them the thing, and these were white people speaking English, and they were like, you know, these people came and did that, and they went. And then it's been 5 years now and there is no hospital. So they're like, can we get this land back and how do we get it? So one of the things I thought I will do is I will do research on who this NGO is and what is their funding, and to see if the name of the local NGO comes up in the name of in the list, funding list of the Swedish NGO, and I did indeed find that. So then I wrote to them saying that, are you aware that, you know, you were going to build this and this was on community land, and this land now no longer belongs to the community. What is your response to it? No response. So then the community in the meanwhile becomes activated to say, let's get the land back and let's do a mass petition to do that. So by the time we get mass petitions now to want to get the land back, the police are saying, we will not touch it because it doesn't belong to the community. They have already signed it off to this person. for his purposes. So now it turns out that the person who the land was written into, it was someone's name, he's actually building an educational, a hostel-based teacher training college.